I'd like to do a little thought experiment together. Imagine waking up one morning and going about your daily tasks. You take a shower, make coffee, and have breakfast. Maybe make sure your pets or kids are fed. But by all accounts, this is a day like any other. But little do you know, your life is going to change in ways you never thought possible. The world is going to change in ways you never thought possible. You pull out your phone to check the news, idly browsing social media posting memes, but one theme keeps standing out. At first, you think it's the same kind of partisan hackery that you become numb to after nearly 2 decades of polarization, riots, and political gridlock. But the more you see, the more concerned you become. This isn't a joke, and this isn't hyperbole. There's been a coup at the White House. The U.S. government has fallen, and there's a new man in charge. But president isn't quite right. This man wasn't elected. They still call him the president to vaguely gesture at continuity, but you already know that this is a total break from the past. This man is something else. A strongman leader. The leader. When you hear who's been installed as the dictator of America, you almost can't believe it. That guy? He'd been a bit of a populist rabble-rouser, but by all accounts, he was a man of the people, beloved by veterans and peace activists alike. He even had a certain cachet in both the right and left wings of the culture war. You would have never thought a guy like him would do something like this. He may have been a veteran, but he railed against the imperial ambitions of the United States and how they hurt both Americans and the rest of the world alike. But, in a way, it kind of made sense. It'd been over a decade of chaos, riots, unemployment. The last president was seen as comically incompetent, and his party had completely lost credibility. The next president took office and started making sweeping changes. Some liked it, some didn't. Some even tried to assassinate him. But no matter what was promised and who was in charge, things just kept getting worse. And now, somebody's made sense of the chaos. Someone's put an end to the violence. Maybe you're indignant, and you're ready to take to the streets. Maybe you think the U.S. hasn't been a democracy for a while now, and we might as well make it official. Maybe you're even indifferent after a decade of unrest, and not even this phases you. But maybe, just maybe, you feel afraid and uncertain, and yet, on some level, you're a little relieved. This guy can't be worse than what came before, right? It may sound like fiction, but the scenario very nearly occurred. In 1933, a cabal of American business magnates allegedly plotted a fascist coup to depose the president. Distraught at what they saw as the destruction of the traditional American way of life by the FDR administration's radical social, economic, and political changes, they made an attempt at their own beer hall putsch. They planned to mobilize the disgruntled World War I veterans into a Yankee Free Corps to storm the White House, depose Roosevelt, and install their own American Mussolini. But this plot failed because they picked the wrong man for the job, one Smedly Darlington Butler. Butler would alert FDR to the plot and testify before Congress on the actions of the plotters, putting a stop to the coup. However, the trial was an anticlimax, with no arrests made and no charges pressed. The news media ranged in their coverage from mocking to indifference. Butler went to the grave a marginalized figure and has largely been forgotten. But almost a century later, some are beginning to re-examine Butler and his claims. There are some who see him as the boy who cried wolf, a prima donna in love with his own legend. Some see him as a hypocritical imperialist who recanted late in life after the damage was already done. Others see Butler as one of the United States' greatest unsung heroes, like an American Cincinnatus. There are even those who see him as a man who had the chance to preserve American greatness and squandered the opportunity of a lifetime. But much in the same way nature abhors a vacuum, history abhors an easy narrative. The story of the business plot, as the conspiracy came to be known, is best understood through the story of Butler himself. He was a complicated man, rife with contradictions, internal strife, and compromise. And his story, and its contradictions, are the very same contradictions of the United States itself. And we are here to tell you that story. Hi, I'm Prester John Andrews.
And I'm James Benson Sarsgaard.
And you're listening to Americana Obscura.
In a few years, the stock market crash of 1929 will be 100 years behind us. And like all historical events past the century mark, the number of people who can remember that time and its aftermath will fade from existence. From history to legend to myth, as the saying goes. But myths and legends have a strange persistence. Look around today and you can see the ghosts of that era lingering behind the tents on the highways of our cities and in the growing populist anger against the tech elites that dominate our era as ruthlessly as the robber barons of a century ago. At the dawn of the American century, the alliance of a burgeoning military and financial might took its first steps in the far reaches of the Pacific and found its apogee in the fallout from the atomic bomb some 15 years after the start of the Great Depression. The events that transpired in between these two milestones are often overlooked and underexplored, but equally critical to an understanding of how we got here. In 1932, the tent cities that would come to dominate the public's imagination of the Great Depression were springing up all over the country. When we think about that era today, we often imagine boxcars full of destitute families and so-called Hoovervilles made up of poor, unemployed workers living on the margins of society. Those poor migrants often get lumped in with the labor activism of the left. But in 1932, a group of disgruntled veterans would assemble on the steps of the Capitol in a way that might look closer to the bands of right-wing Americans who amassed on those same grounds 89 years later to protest the results of the 2020 election. Like all great movements, they needed a champion. They found theirs in the aforementioned Smedly Butler, a retired veteran of American involvement in imperial adventures abroad, who had evolved into a fierce critic of his government and its callous disregard for those it sent to fight its battles and fill its coffers. What no one gathered on those steps could have known at the time is that Butler and his comrades' actions there would be the catalyst for one of the strangest and most overlooked conspiracies in American history, a story of populism set against the rising tide of fascism, and a conspiracy to depose a U.S. president that seems too bizarre and fanciful to be real, more myth than history, but one whose rough outlines, barely visible under the wreckage of the past, evoke a picture of an America facing many of the same challenges as the one we live in today. This is a story about the building of America, although it begins somewhere in the middle, at the turning of a century and the first steps of this country onto the world stage that it would come to dominate by the middle of it. It's a story about empire and the troubles that are part and parcel with its construction. We're living now in the receding shadows of that empire, and so with this series, we'd like to take a look at the life of the one man whose adventures and misdeeds have largely been eclipsed and forgotten by the powerful forces he set out to serve.
In May of 1932, a group of men climbed onto a freight train in Portland, Oregon, and began the long journey across the country. They weren't hobos exactly. The train had been lent to them in good faith by the railroad, although they were destitute. There were 400 of them, all of them veterans, and by the time they reached Washington, they had picked up at least another 1,000 men and their families to the cause. They would come to be known as the Bonus Expeditionary Force, and all they were asking for was the money their government had promised to pay them. So I think this would probably be a good time to unpack the situation a little bit and set the stage for what's going on in 1932 economically and culturally in America. PJ, you want to take it?
Yeah, so when looking at the bonus march and the business plot, I think it's important to look at it in the context of the Great Depression. This is a topic we all heard about growing up in history class, but it's often only a chapter or two that's glossed over as a footnote leading up to World War II. But I think the social and political environment that the Great Depression created is key to understanding everything that would come next. But before getting into the Great Depression, we should look at the 1930 that America thought it was going into. Before World War I, the United States was seen as somewhat of a backwater by the powers of the Old World. But after the war and the destruction of Europe, the United States came out of the conflict as the world's largest creditor, industrial base, and strongest economy. This is when the United States enters what is known as the Jazz Age. This is a period of economic activity in the United States that doesn't really have much precedent. Credit is cheap and business is booming. Consumer culture as we know it takes off. Car ownership becomes widespread. Hollywood and popular culture begin to solidify into what we know them as today. This is the era of flappers, speakeasies, and the Great Gatsby. At this point, American society is something that feels modern, confident, and unstoppable. This was until the 1929 stock market crash. The image of the stockbroker jumping out of the skyscraper is an urban myth, but it's symbolic of a very real mood that came over the American people. This was something that was significantly worse than the economic downturns that had come before, and people were losing faith in the system itself. Basically, overnight, the United States went from the strongest economy on earth to seeing everything fall apart. People lost their savings, local banks went under, and credit was totally unobtainable for the average person. This is when we saw unemployment rates skyrocket, and people were hungry and angry.
Yeah, I mean, unemployment at 25%, which that's unthinkable for us today. Like, I think the worst unemployment's been in the last decade, when it's actually been pretty bad at times, is like it's around, like, if it's like 11%, that's like insanely bad. So for us to try to imagine that high of a figure, a quarter of the country unemployed, that's crazy. Like it's just definitely was a rough time for people.
Yeah. So this is when we start seeing what would come to be known as Hoovervilles popping up all across the country. And these were basically open-air homeless camps. There were whole shanty towns built from scrap wood and cardboard where families lived in absolute poverty. And this is also where we see the iconic image of the Great Depression of the soup line. I mean, so many people were out of work that the only way to survive was to rely on charity or government relief just to meet the most basic needs. And at the same time, violence and instability arise in a way that the country hadn't really seen before. Crime spikes, riots break out, and political violence is becoming more common. And there's just this growing sense that the social fabric of American society itself is coming apart at the seams.
Yeah, I think, this wasn't just a recession. It was like society, the wheels had fallen off. The system itself had failed. It was a system collapse. Like everything really seemed like the floor had just fallen out from under people.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of difficult to imagine what that would have been like. Less than a decade earlier, the United States had just won a war and come out of it as the strongest economy on earth. They're on top of the world. And then, almost overnight, the entire system collapses. It must have been some serious whiplash. And this is where President Hoover begins to become the face of collapse for ordinary Americans. At least to them, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what kind of mess you inherit as the president. It's your job to fix it. And to be fair, Hoover was actually a very capable peacetime president. He was an engineer and an organizer who had been in charge of the U.S. supply chains during World War I. The logistical skills that had helped him in World War I would be little to no help in the crisis that he faced. Hoover came out of the old guard of American society and conservative economic thinking. The basic logic was that markets would go up and down, and recessions were a painful but natural part of the economic cycle. They thought if you wait a recession out long enough, the market would correct itself. And in Hoover's defense, that approach had worked in the past. But that was when the U.S. economy was more regional and less interconnected. But by 1930, the United States was underpinning a global financial system. So when Wall Street collapsed, it took the entire world economy with it. And in this newly globalized world, the old logic of patience and restraint just didn't seem to work anymore. And to his credit, Hoover did try to respond to the crisis. He backed major public works, such as the Hoover Dam, and pushed for emergency measures to stabilize banks and industry. But to a public that was hungry, unemployed, and desperate, it felt like too little, too late. And by the early 1930s, public frustration with the Hoover administration was reaching a fever pitch.
I mean, like the United States had already been through an extended populist phase before that. The William Jennings Bryan, like that whole period that was like 10, 20 years before this. So it's like this era of like from 1900 to 1930 was just it's again very difficult for us, even though it feels like history is changing rapidly below our feet today. Back then, it was probably changing even faster in a more head spinning way, until it reached this crescendo right around the stock market crash.
Yeah. And I think this is probably a good time to re-examine where we come in with the beginning of our story with the bonus expeditionary force, because this was kind of the backdrop that everything was against. So we saw this massive unemployment, crime, starvation. The economy was seemingly in a downspin. All these banks were closing left and right, and this is where we find the bonus expeditionary force, who are these World War I veterans who are trying to get early payment on their bonuses. So James, do you want to expand on this a little bit and tell us a little bit more about the bonus expeditionary force?
Yeah, so the bonus army, these were men who had fought in the Great War and America's military adventures in Latin America and the Pacific. And so in 1924, the government had set up a deferred payment system for their bonuses that they were supposed to have received after combat. But after the stock market crash of 1929, everything changed. The men were growing desperate and petitioned the government for an advance on their bonuses to no avail. It was the Great Depression, and broke was the order of the day. Those men and their families who traveled from across the U.S. set up shanty towns on the banks of the Anacostia River across from the capital, and by June they numbered anywhere from 20 to 40,000 strong. Things were quickly getting out of hand. The House voted to pay the men what they were owed, but the bill died in the Senate. The President Hoover had promised to veto it anyway. When the D.C. police were unable to vacate the protesters, Hoover turned to the military, among them 3 men who would later go on to be household names. The army was unleashed on the camps of military men and their families. Things would get ugly fast.
And this is where we step into one of the most shameful chapters of American history. It's honestly hard to imagine what this would have looked like. You have American veterans. These were men who had fought in the Great War, who had quite literally helped build the prosperity of the 1920s, who were marching on Washington with their families. Not threatening violence or storming the White House or anything like that. They were just asking for the compensation that they'd been promised. And instead of being met with respect or even basic sympathy, they're treated like common tramps. And look, I know we don't exactly treat our veterans well today, but this was an order of magnitude difference. These were men who were living in shanty towns, starving, desperate, and the President of the United States is publicly treating them with disdain. Hoover would say of the bonus marchers, quote, "A considerable part of those remaining are not veterans. Many are communists and persons with criminal records. They have taken advantage of the generosity of the government and the sympathy of the public to pursue their own ends." And that's Hoover's line, that these aren't even real veterans, that they're radicals who are exploiting sympathy. And these were men who were once seen as heroes who are now being described as bums looking for a handout. So, already off the bat, to be so callous and to just they're a bunch of commies trying to get a handout to the veterans who essentially made, up until very recently, what your economic prosperity was built on, is something kind of unimaginable today. And I think that's, part of the reason why this was swept under the rug for so long.
Yeah, my understanding of the public reaction to those kind of sentiments coming from Hoover was that it was basically cope. I don't think that I don't think a lot of people were really buying it. It doesn't seem like that really resonated with the voting public and the American public at large, that they were like, okay, these guys seem like decent family men and their families like just asking for their money. They don't seem like communists to me. That seems to me like that's my read of the situation.
Yeah.
You think that's fair?
I think that's probably fair. It's so difficult to tell because at this time, we don't have as much information on what the general public said. But as we'll discuss in a little bit about the fallout from what happened from this incident, I think that's probably a good guess. But before we move on, there's something I want to emphasize about Hoover calling the bonus marchers communists. So I think today the term communist has become something of a meaningless polemic. But in 1932, this is a very serious accusation. And so the first Red Scare had ended maybe about a decade earlier. And I think when a lot of people heard the word communist, that's what kind of came to mind. And people still remembered all these mass arrests, deportation, and there was this very real feeling that communists were this eternal enemy who could destroy a country from within. And to be fair, it was a fear that was not totally unfounded, since not so long before we saw the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and this was a brutal revolution that saw the deaths of millions. So I think when the president called these men communists, he's basically declaring them as enemies of the state. And it's not really that dissimilar from the way that we use the word terrorists today. It's just kind of a way to give carte blanche to, unperson somebody. So if you think of that in that light, you see Hoover is kind of stripping away the legitimacy these men had as veterans, and he's saying that, they're these scary group of radical communists and not some hungry veterans. And I think, basically the idea was when you do that, it becomes a lot easier to justify whatever's going to be happening next. And this brings us back to the conflict between the protesting veterans and the current U.S. government. But, as we alluded to, the men who would lead this shameful operation would go on to be some of the heroes of World War II.
Right. So first you had General Douglas MacArthur, the Army Chief of Staff since 1930. He took personal command of the operation and directly ordered the violent dispersal of the camps, defying even Hoover's instructions to show restraint.
Second, we would see General George S. Patton. At the head of the cavalry squadron, Patton personally led the charge through the streets of Washington with drawn sabers against the unarmed American veterans. It was an early glimpse of the ruthless ambition that he would later make him famous in Europe.
And third, Major Dwight D. Eisenhower. At this point, only MacArthur's aide, he opposed using the army in this way, warning against escalation. But he was there that day, part of an operation he later tried to downplay. Think about that for a moment. 3 men who would later be celebrated as the heroes of World War II, the defenders of democracy. Here they were in 1932, ordered to turn their weapons on their fellow citizens, ordered to scatter men who just wanted the money they'd been promised. It was virtually unprecedented, a vulgar display of power by the establishment against its own veterans. But before the troops and the tear gas, one man much beloved by the bonus army came to speak to them and raise their spirits. That would be our man, Major Smedly Butler. So, PJ, who was Smedly Butler, and why did he break ranks from the Army brass?
Smedly Darlington Butler was no ordinary soldier. A 2-time Medal of Honor recipient, he was revered by the enlisted troops in a way that few generals ever were. But by the 1930s, Butler had grown deeply disillusioned. He still loved the Marine Corps as an institution, but he hated the jobs he'd been sent to do, which he saw as propping up banks, fruit companies, and oil interests in foreign lands. In his pamphlet, War is a Racket, he would call himself a gangster for capitalism. And in a lot of ways, Butler is the complete opposite of the men who would go on to become the heroes of World War II. While MacArthur or Patton are rising stars in the Army hierarchy, Butler is drifting towards the American tradition of anti-establishment populism. Butler was beloved by the common enlisted man and despised by the top brass. To the former, he was a symbol of hope. To the latter, he was an inconvenient rabble-rouser. So when the bonus marchers set up camp in Washington, Butler goes to see them. He doesn't arrive with an entourage or press team. He walks to the camp and talks with the men. He trades stories from France and Haiti and Nicaragua. He sympathized with them and their plight. He tells them they have every right to be there, but he also warns them not to give Hoover or the Army an excuse for violence. He tells them, quote, "Take it from me, this is the greatest demonstration of Americanism we've ever had. Pure Americanism. Don't make any mistake about it. You've got the sympathy of the American people. Now don't you lose it." Butler never defects from the military. He doesn't take up the marchers' cause in any official way, but morally and emotionally, he's standing on the other side of the picket line, so to speak. And that's the part which makes him such a dangerous figure to the people watching the crisis unfold.
Yeah, he was also not explicitly ideological. He didn't really care much for politics. Hoover claimed that, the march was infiltrated by communists, but the communists seemed to refute this themselves. There's a quote from Earl Browder of the American Communist Party about Smedley that, quote, "He is a simple man with no concept of politics. He is just a soldier fighting for the soldiers." And to To illustrate this point, here is a quote from Butler speaking to the bonus army in defiance of the top army brass. Makes me so damn mad. A whole lot of people speak of you as tramps. By God, they didn't speak of you as tramps in 1917 and 18. And unfortunately, after Butler left the camp, things took a turn for the worse. So on July 28th, 1932, MacArthur leads cavalry, infantry, and tanks to clear out the camps. Tear gas, burning of tents and belongings, and ultimately the deaths of 2 veterans result from these actions. And I think it's important to note, too, that MacArthur acted in open defiance of the president. He defied Hoover and Hoover had told him not to cross the Anacostia Bridge, and MacArthur did it anyway, thinking that he was, working to suppress a communist uprising.
So in the days after the march turned violent, General Douglas MacArthur defended its actions. He told the press, "We have not taken over the city at all. The force that the army used was merely in conjunction with the civil authorities to clear out the camps. When they call on us, we're going to help them." So MacArthur wanted the world to believe that this was just an ordinary, restrained, and justified use of force. But the veterans told a different story. Cavalry units rode through the streets, sabers drawn. George Patton, who was just a major at the time, allegedly led the charge directly against these unarmed men. The same men he had fought beside in France little more than a decade earlier. Tear gas filled the air, encampments were set ablaze, and the families fled wherever they could carry. For many Americans watching, this looked less like civil order and more like open war on veterans. So we talk a lot about the vibe shift in modern times, but I think it's safe to say this was kind of the vibe shift of its era. The U.S. government turning its own armed forces against veterans was something that was completely unprecedented, and I think probably was something that totally turned public opinion against Hoover.
Yeah, and it flipped hard against Hoover after this. One of the protesters said, quote, "The American flag means nothing to me after this." And this is coming from, a veteran who had fought to defend his country. And the Washington Daily News, hardly a leftist rag, ran the quote, "If the army must be called out to make war on unarmed civilians, this is no longer America," end quote.
The crackdown on the bonus army was a scandal that could hardly have come at a worse time for an already unpopular president. The sight of veterans, men who had once fought for America, being gassed, beaten, and driven out of Washington by tanks and sabers was the final nail in the coffin for Herbert Hoover.
Yeah. It wasn't just the bonus march, but I think it's fair to say that that was the final nail. He had really been up against it with his inability to govern through the crisis of the Great Depression, and he was seen as cold and illegitimate. And it just you had FDR coming along, and I think that FDR was somewhat of a charismatic figure. I mean, quite a charismatic figure, but even with that, I still think a lot of people were voting less for him and more against Hoover.
Mm-hmm. Smedly Butler himself would later say that that basically he wasn't necessarily supporting FDR; he was just against Hoover. And I think it's interesting to see, and I think we can all think of examples probably in the last couple election cycles for U.S. presidents where people don't necessarily even like the candidate they're voting for; they're just voting against the other guy or gal.
Yeah. People would describe themselves as anti-Hoover Republicans or what have you, and that's something we still see today in modern politics and probably always will. But voters rejected not just Hoover but laissez-faire governance writ large.
In 1932, in November, the voters delivered their verdict. Hoover was swept aside in a landslide. A new man was coming to power, and he promised change. Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office in March of 1933 as a radical hope for the poor and the unemployed. But to the nation's wealthy elites, this was something else. He was a threat. Almost immediately, he launched into what became known later as the New Deal, a sweeping set of programs that reshaped banking, agriculture, and labor. To ordinary Americans, this was salvation. But to the entrenched business leaders, it was a revolution. So FDR's first year in office had a number of red flags for the elites. In some ways, his administration was as big of a revolution in the US as the Bolsheviks or fascists were in Europe. It's very hard to overstate just how much of a break from the past the FDR administration was, since we all live in the post-New Deal era. But from March of 1933 to 1934, the administration had passed a series of sweeping reforms that would be an existential threat to the old guard of the American elite. James, do you want to maybe tell us a little bit more about those sweeping changes that seem so concerning to the old school of the American elite?
Yeah, and without getting too deep into detail on these things yet, broadly, these programs included a move away from the gold standard, and this was something that galvanized the opposition to FDR from the financial elite probably more than anything else he did. And the Glass-Steagall Act, which basically made it so that banks can't gamble with private money, and the implementation of the now famous Civilian Conservation Corps, which was a tremendous boon to the economy post-Depression and put people immediately back to work. So FDR and his administration may have been more cynical in their desires to get men back to work with the Civilian Conservation Corps. Perhaps they had an eye on Europe and the Bolshevik and fascist revolutions of the 1920s and 30s. Perhaps they saw the danger of having large groups of angry young men with military training and nothing to lose. Because if the Roosevelt administration didn't find a way to mobilize them and give them something to do, perhaps someone else would.
It's the summer of 1933, Newton Square, Pennsylvania, a quiet suburban home miles from the marble halls of Washington. Inside sat one of America's most decorated soldiers, retired Major General Smedly Darlington Butler. 2 medals of honor, decades of service, a man loved by his troops but loathed by the brass. He made enemies by speaking too plainly about corruption, but his reputation with the veterans was unshakable. That summer, a visitor arrived. Gerald C. McGuire. On paper, he was just a bond salesman from Grayson Murphy and Company. In reality, he was a well-connected man tied to the leadership of the American Legion. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man backed by money and influence. He came bearing flattery. He said that they wanted Butler to give a speech at the Legion convention. Nothing unusual about that, except for the subject matter.
The topic was the gold standard. FDR had just taken the country off gold, a move that bankers and old money elites despised. McGuire framed it as patriotism, as a crusade to save the dollar to protect the veterans' benefits. But there was something slippery about the way he talked. He hinted at powerful friends, but never named them. Never said exactly who stood behind him, just that Butler would have their support. To most men, this would have seemed like an opportunity. But to Butler, it smelled like a setup. He never trusted the American Legion's leadership, always seeing it as too close to Wall Street. So he listened and he nodded and he made notes of the details. But inside, his suspicion only grew. Something was off about him. And this was only the beginning. And later on, Butler would go on to testify about this time, and he would say, quote, "They wanted me to go to the American Legion convention and lead a movement to get it passed as a resolution in favor of the gold standard. I said I didn't believe it."
Yeah, and at this point, the plot thickens, and we start to see the strings. So a bit of a cat and mouse game between the two men went on between late 1933 and early 1934, in which time there were multiple visits between them. McGuire returned for several follow-up meetings at Butler's home in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and possibly a meeting in Cape May, New Jersey.
Yeah, and this is when we kind of see this interesting back and forth between them. Later on during the trial, Butler would say that, he didn't trust McGuire, and he was trying to perhaps get something out of him slowly but surely, since he thought that there was something else to McGuire's motives. And we see some interesting times where they would have meetings, and sometimes it was cordial, and other times you would see Butler getting up and yelling at McGuire. Um, and there's some other times where Butler was on speaking tours, and kind of funny enough, you would see McGuire following them almost like you would see somebody following like a deadhead, or somebody following around a band these days. And now, back then, you saw McGuire was following Butler in his speeches, and Butler was playing a little bit coy at this point and saying, yeah, well, I can't say he can't follow me, he can't come to these speeches. And they were kind of going back and forth at this point.
Yeah, between the two of them, the gold standard is still the pretext that McGuire uses, but he starts to slip in stuff about these powerful backers that are interested in, quote, making use of Butler's popularity with the veterans. And he suggests that the American Legion could be used as a political force to, quote, maintain order if things get bad. And I think Butler read that as coded language that was pretty much hardline anti-New Deal, anti-strike kind of rhetoric.
Yeah, and also during this time when he wasn't spending time trying to speak to Butler, that McGuire would make a visit to Europe and investigate some of these other paramilitary fascist movements that were happening at the time. And he would look at the Italian fascist movement, the German National Socialists, and later we would find out that he didn't really think that they were a good fit for the American movement that they were trying to create. And he would later settle on trying to base a movement off of the Croix de Feu, which is a French word or French term that essentially means the cross of fire. And they're this right-wing veterans organization, and their aesthetics and what they were shooting for, that McGuire felt it was a little bit more in line with something that would play well with Americans. Because while we saw the Italian fascist or the German National Socialist Party being more explicitly paramilitary and revolutionary, the Croix de Feu were trying to work within the system, and they're a lot more orderly and patriotic and trying to work within the existing constitution. And I think McGuire would say that he felt that that was a lot more palatable to the movement they were trying to create for America.
Yeah, I think it's important to make the distinction that McGuire was trying to make here, where he explicitly avoided this sort of Nazi racial ideology or Mussolini style mass fascist violence. And instead, he emphasized discipline, unity, and the moral authority of the veterans. And this was sort of what I think a lot of historians would look at the time as like this sort of American compatible authoritarian movement, or maybe you could even use the term American fascistic movement. And it was more of like this man in a white horse kind of moment for McGuire. That's how he would pitch it to Butler.
Yeah, and that man on a white horse is, I think, probably something that might have even appealed to Butler on a certain level, since I think to a certain degree that might have been how he saw himself. And there's a not insignificant tradition of that kind of leader in American history. You have your George Washingtons, Andrew Jackson, etc., Ulysses S. Grant, all these different former generals who became leaders. And I wonder if on a certain level that might have appealed to Butler. But regardless, at this point, nothing had been quite set out right. McGuire was still being very coy about what he was trying to propose. And this happened all throughout late 1933 and early 1934, until Butler just became, you could probably say, became frustrated with McGuire and accosted him. And this is when, even at this point, he became, I think it probably was offensive to Butler, because at a certain point, McGuire even offered him $3,000 to speak at the American Legion. And, putting aside, $3,000 is no small amount of money today. Back then, it was the equivalent of about, $60,000 just to go to, one speaking affair. And instead of taking this as a as a compliment or feel like, maybe it was showing that McGuire was serious and being respectful, that, this is something that enraged Butler. And I think at this point, McGuire, felt like he had to come out and actually say what he's trying to do. And this is where you could say the mask comes off, so to speak. Because in the summer of 1934, this is when the mask finally does come off. Gerald McGuire came back to Butler's home with a new kind of pitch. There were no more vague hints about patriotic speeches and no more coy talk about the gold standard. This time, he laid his plan out in full. An army of 500,000 veterans would be organized under Butler's command. They would march on Washington, not in defiance, but under the banner of protecting the president. In reality, the goal was to pressure Roosevelt to step aside. His health was going to be cited as the excuse. In his place, a new office would be created, the Secretary of General Affairs, a position with sweeping powers, kind of like a shadow presidency. And this was the role that Butler was going to fill.
The catch? Roosevelt would remain as the figurehead, the smiling mask of continuity, while real control flowed elsewhere. With the financiers in the shadows, McGuire dropped names like Grayson Murphy and hinted at the DuPonts, but he would never put the full list on the table. Just enough to remind Butler that serious money was backing this scheme. And through it all, McGuire insisted Butler was the only man with the credibility to pull it off. Only he could command the loyalty of the veterans. Only he could sell the plan. Butler listened. He asked questions. He nodded along. But inside, he was appalled. He wasn't buying the pitch. He was gathering evidence. Because now, there was no mistaking it. This was a conspiracy, and they wanted him to lead it. And this is where Butler decides to act. He makes a contact with a journalist named Paul Comely French, a man he knew from his Philadelphia connections, and he trusted him. So he assigns him to go and kind of vet McGuire and verify the story. So French meets with McGuire independently and confirms that McGuire is talking about an armed veterans march and a new government structure. And with this corroboration, Butler and French take the story to Congress. And this sets up the trial.
It's early November 1934, and Butler has had enough. With journalist Paul Comely French at his side, he takes the story straight to Congress. The two men sit before Representatives John McCormick of Massachusetts and Samuel Dickstein of New York. This was the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, the body that would later morph into the House of Un-American Activities Committee. This should have been the turning point. Butler lays it all out, the meetings, the promises, the names, and the money. And French backs him up with his own account of McGuire practically confirming the plot. On paper, this was the moment where, in a spy thriller, the villains are unmasked and the plotters are dragged into the light. But that's not what happened. Instead, the hearings trickled on. McGuire denies everything. The committee confirmed parts of Butler's story, but never named the real power behind it. There are no arrests and no trials. No headlines. Just silence. What should have been explosive ended up being a nothing burger. And that's the strange anticlimax of this part of the story. Was Butler exaggerating? Was the government covering up for the powerful? Or did both sides want this whole affair to just disappear quietly?
So in November of 1934, the hearings begin. Butler testifies under oath, and he's calm but emphatic. He names names and gets into the details. He repeats the 500,000 veterans line and details about how he was to be named the Secretary of General Affairs under McGuire's proposal. And he paints the plot as the real threat.
but admits he never saw direct orders from the alleged financiers. When Butler took the stand, he named only a few men directly. At the center was Gerald McGuire, the bond salesman who approached him and carried the proposal. Butler also named wealthy figures McGuire claimed were backing the effort, including Grayson Murphy, a Wall Street banker, and Robert Sterling Clark, heir to the Singer sewing machine fortune, both of whom admitted connections to McGuire but denied any coup plot. The congressional committee investigating the claims found Butler's testimony credible and confirmed that discussions of a fascist-style organization had taken place, but it stopped short of naming additional individuals, referring instead to men of wealth and leading financiers. In the decades since, researchers have pointed to figures associated with the anti-New Deal American Liberty League, including DuPont family members and Morgan-linked backers, as part of the same elite backlash. Others go further, speculating about names like Prescott Bush or William Randolph Hearst. But in the official record, those figures remain ghosts, never named under oath, never charged, and never confirmed, leaving just enough shadow to keep the mystery alive.
And throughout the trial, McGuire basically just denies anything. His defense kind of boils down to, it was just a prank, bro. And that was more or less actually what he said. And he says that Butler misunderstands a lot of talk about keeping the Legion strong. And he more or less just paints Butler as a cranky, paranoid old soldier.
And the committee would call other witnesses, mostly Legion figures, who also would deny knowledge or feign forgetfulness. And it seems that the key defense here of both McGuire and his alleged conspirators is basically plausible deniability. It's a he said, she said kind of thing. It's always like, well, he just didn't really understand what we were trying to say. And like you say, it's like, oh, it's just a joke, bro. No big deal.
Yeah. And I think that's part of what's very both interesting and frustrating about this trial, because even nearly 100 years later, there's never been a fully unredacted report on everything that went on in the trial. In January 1935, after months of hearing, the McCormick-Dickstein Committee finally released its report. On paper, it looked like a vindication for Butler. Yes, Gerald McGuire had spoken of organizing veterans into a force that could be used to influence government policy. That much was confirmed. But then came the catch. The committee said there was no direct evidence tying big business leaders to the plot. No documents, no smoking gun, and no names spelled out in black and white. And without all that, there would be no prosecutions. Not a single man would face trial.
The press treated it as a curiosity at best, a joke at worst. Headlines mocked Butler as a crank. Editorials shrugged it off. Perhaps most strangely, the Roosevelt administration stayed silent and hardly even acknowledged the case. Maybe they didn't want to antagonize powerful business interests in the middle of a fragile recovery. Maybe they preferred to keep the threat in their back pocket, quiet warning to the very elites who hated them. Either way, the scandal fizzled out. What should have been a political earthquake ended up as barely a tremor. And that anticlimax is what makes the business plot so haunting. Something happened. But what exactly is still a matter of debate. The only thing we know for certain is that it all came down to one man's word, that of Smedly Butler.
So, James, what were your thoughts on this story going into it?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, when you had pitched this concept to me, I had a vague idea of who Smedly Butler was, but I really knew next to nothing about the business plot and the conspiracy. So it's been really interesting to learn about it. And I guess the main thing is that I mean, I guess I'd say I'm not surprised that it didn't wind up going anywhere, knowing what we do now about like how, these sort of like, I don't want to use the word conspiracy theories, but that's basically what it is. And there's certainly always a lot of smoke, and you never know if there's much fire behind it. So, I feel like it's a very, very interesting and obviously unexplored conspiracy theory. Like with the relevance of that to today's politics and how people are so interested in conspiracy theories now, I'm frankly kind of surprised that this one doesn't get more consideration.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel the same way. Like, I kind of had the opposite, coming from in the opposite direction. Like, I basically heard about this as, you know, uh, it's something you hear about if you're a fan of history. Like, it's a really cool story if you take it at face value, at least up until the trial part. Because if I'm honest, this is something that really plays to my prejudices. It's just such a cool story. It's like an American Cincinnatus, basically. And for the audience who hasn't heard, like in ancient Rome, there was a general or a citizen named Cincinnatus, who there are barbarians at the gates, and they gave him like, we're going to make you dictator to save us from this threat of the barbarians. And right after that, as soon as he deals with the threat, he gives it up. Obviously Smedly Butler didn't take that dictatorship, but he did have that same parallel of, giving up power when it was offered, when you could have been a dictator. And you could have abused that power. But the more I read into it, the more I found it being more and more complicated, partially for the reasons that you mentioned. And at least for me, like, I originally wanted to do this project because I felt like I'm a big history buff, but as much I could tell you a lot about ancient Rome or Sumeria, but I kind of embarrassingly only know my own country's history in very broad strokes. And this was a really good framing device to get into this portion of history where, like, I feel is like maybe one of the most unexplored periods in U.S. history, like between World War I and World War II.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I feel kind of the same. I think it's very tempting to draw allusions from our current moment to ancient Rome, the transition from the Republic to the Empire. But why do that when you can look into the not so distant past where there are still people alive today who were born in the aftermath of this? So it's very timely and it's very relevant, especially because we see so many parallels between 1933 and today. We have lots of political unrest, mass protests, like, the protests at the Capitol, all these things. We're sort of seeing that happen again on both the left and the right.
Yeah, there we see at the same time, like, that's one of the things that really struck me reading about this, is like just the deep mistrust and cynicism that the average people had for the government in the United States at the time. And, it's not hard to see why, just given the context of the Great Depression and Hoover being a pretty incompetent president by, most people's standards today. And really, like, again, like, this is something I kept on coming up against again and again. Like, this is kind of the era where the world we live in now was really created. And particularly with, the FDR administration and how, allegedly it was almost deposed and there was almost a coup because there is, in some corners, such a strong reaction against it.
Yeah, you even had the, and we'll get into this later, but you had the attempted assassination on FDR just before the business plot sort of like got underway. And, that's obviously, there's parallels to today's time and in the past before this, but, that's certainly like, this was a time that is just full of interesting history to study. And, it's a cliche to say history repeats itself, but, this is an ancient history. It rhymes with where we are today.
So at least to me, like, on one level, like, it does seem like a very shady story, like, between all, like, the FDR administration not really investigating it, or the press not really taking it seriously, where, at least to me, like, today, just about anybody, like, whoever was supposedly supposed to be put in charge of this coup, like, it would be a media firestorm. So that's a very suspicious to me. But to me, the part that was like the most suspicious was like, why him? Why would you have somebody who is a vocal anti-fascist as the leader of your fascist movement?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, in some ways, I still feel like I can't really have a satisfactory answer for that, even after reading about it. It could have been poor judgment on McGuire's part. They didn't do their homework, but they met so many times. And all of those times, Butler was relatively upfront about his opposition to this proposed coup. So, maybe they thought he was more flexible than his image suggested, and it was just a matter of breaking him down. But, there's other explanations too, which will be really interesting to get into as we progress.
Yeah. Butler as a man is somebody who's a lot more complicated than, the surface level myth would have you believe. We're going to be diving into it in later episodes, but Butler was somebody who, he would criticize the American government and military and the capitalist system more broadly, but he was somebody who participated in this system. We'll get into it more deeply in later episodes, but Butler was, somebody who had experience, in coups and deposing democratically elected governments. So you maybe, or if you want to do a coup and depose a democratically elected government, you find somebody who has experience,
Yeah. So, we have ourselves a pretty good mystery here. So there's no hard proof, only testimony. There's political motivations on both sides here. And, there's always the possibility of personal vendettas too. So we kind of want to get across, like, I don't know, the frustration of that from like the perspective of someone trying to understand it, that, perhaps we'll never get a clean answer about this, but we're going to try to explore it as much as we can in the coming episodes for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of as I alluded to, we're going to be taking a look at Butler's life and his military career and the hypocrisy in that career that, maybe would have led people like McGuire to believe, maybe Butler was just, doing that classic American policy of, talking about the beauty and sanctity of democracy from one side of your mouth and then, being an imperialist from the other side.
Yeah, and I mean, Butler's personality is worth mentioning here too. He was a fairly charismatic guy, very confrontational, and maybe a little bit of a media hound.
Yeah, he's somebody, who I think would do very well today in the social media age. He was somebody who, you might say was very in love with his own legend and very self-conscious of his image in the media, and this was even like in the fledgling days of mass media. So one does wonder, like, as the media at the time did say, was like, was he over his skis? Was he just trying to, play up his own ego? Because as we said, this is a really good story.
Right. Yeah. I mean, could he have exaggerated it to, further his own self-image? It's possible, So, I mean, I think there's really like three different theories that we're going to explore here. So there's the old saying, there's three sides to every story, my side, your side, and the truth. Well, we could phrase that perhaps in this context to say that we have the Butler Maximus version, that he was entirely truthful, the plot was real and went down exactly as he described. Or perhaps there's the McGuire Maximalist version, that McGuire was telling the truth and that Butler was a crank, or he misunderstood or fabricated, or maybe that it's just somewhere in between.
So here's what this show is really about. The business plot is one of the strangest and most unsettling stories in American history. It's a story with no clear ending and no smoking gun and no easy answers. At the center of it all is one man, Smedly Darlington Butler, a man who was a war hero, a rebel, a critic of American empire, and somehow a figurehead of a would-be fascist coup.
Our goal isn't to solve it. It is to explore it through Butler's life and contradictions.
We're going to be doing a limited series here. We're going to trace Butler's early life and his rise through the Marine Corps, as well as his role in America's imperial adventures abroad.
Then we'll get into his disillusionment with military and political elites and the turbulent 1930s, the bonus march, unrest, populism, and the business plot.
Then we're going to get into the trial and its ultimate anticlimax, as well as his final years and his legacy.
We're going to dig into history, the politics of the era, and the personalities involved, and why this strange moment still resonates today.
And so here's where we're going to ask for audience participation. We want you to start looking into the case with us, read some of the sources, look into it, and come up with your own theories and, share with us on Substack or social media and post comments and let us know what you think.
We'll be releasing new episodes once a month, so you'll have time to dig into each chapter with us before the next one drops.
So with that, I'd like to say thank you for listening to Americana Obscura. My name is Prester John Anders.
And I'm James Benson Sarsgaard. We can't wait to explore the mystery and the man together. In episode 2, To Quake Before God.